Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight's talk on antiques, coming to you live from the Brass Armadillo Antique Mall in Denver, Colorado. I'm Gary Stover. We're here every week at this time on Sunday evening for a talk on antiques. Good evening. Thank you for joining me for tonight's talk on antiques, coming to you from the Brass Armadillo Antique Mall in Denver, Colorado. I'm Gary Stover, and I again tonight have the distinct pleasure of having as guest Chris, who is here to relate one of the most improbable stories that you have ever heard. It relates to a series of events going back to the mid to late 1960s and will culminate in Chris's recount of personages who were involved in the Charles Manson murder case. We have here a painting, we have a Pinocchio, and we have a little book. All of these feature into a story that happened with Chris very early in his life. He was just a child, but which I think will shed some new perspective on those events which culminated in Cielo Drive in Los Angeles in 1969, when Sharon Tate, Gibby Folger, and two other people were brutally murdered by the Charles Manson gang. But this is not a story tonight which is going to concentrate on the negative aspects of that story. Chris is going to be telling us things that I think shed a new light, a light that should have been shown on these people who were involved in this horrendous murder all those years ago. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Gary. It's my pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure to have you, and I've been involved over the last several months while some of these pieces of the puzzle have fallen in place, and I'm so anxious that Chris be able to relate all of this to you, because there are many aspects of this story, one of which is how all of these things came together over the last year.
Yes, it's amazing. I would never have thought. But it really, this whole thing starts with my mother.
Yes.
And my mother was in several Hollywood films in the early 1950s, and she was also a great model.
Yes.
In the 1950s and 1960s. And through my mother, all of these things correlate and have come together, and how I am drawn into this whole thing is really via my mother, who's still with us, and she's a wonderful lady and a very great person, and this is amazing. You
know, Chris, you referred me to a couple of the movies that she was in.
Yes.
And I found them on YouTube.
Yes.
What were they?
Lovely to Look At.
Lovely to Look At, I saw that.
Yes, Jupiter's Darling, Athena.
How would you identify, if you think of Lovely to Look At, how would you identify your mother if someone wanted to go on YouTube and look at it?
She's blonde and beautiful in the fashion show, and she is a very distinctive hairstyle, and she is the most statuesque and photogenic, and really the only blonde in that whole fashion show, and she's quite striking.
I found her.
Yeah.
It was okay, so your mother, the story starts with your mother. And yes. her acquaintances.
Yes, my mother was very good friends in the 1950s, and through her death in the 1960s, Mary Hayward Weir, who was the wife of a steel magnate, and then she became the heiress of his fortune. But she was a socialite in New York, and of course in Pennsylvania, where she was living at the time. And this all really relates, because through the circles that my mother ran in New York, she came into contact and become very friendly with Gibby Folger. I speak of Abigail Folger, descendant of the Folger coffee family, and heiress of the Folger coffee fortune.
Right. Okay, so your mother knew Mary Weir?
Yes.
Okay. Just one word of caution here. we're going to be throwing around some names here tonight, and there are 4 Polish names that are a little bit difficult for an American audience. And the first one we're going to talk about is Jerzy Kosinski.
Yes.
You might know him, a famous novelist, American-Polish novelist. How does Jerzy Kosinski fit in?
Well, Kosinski was married to Mary Hayward Weir after her husband died. They courted for about 6 months, and my mother went to their wedding and everything, and she's very good friends with her. And so, but he was an interesting character. He was very brilliant, but he was a little eccentric. And I think many brilliant people have their own idiosyncrasies and can be eccentric, but he was truly a very gifted writer and a wonderful author. He was highly, highly blessed and gifted. And she also was so wonderful and a very warm person. There was no sense, at least from my own memories, which are, because I was so young at the time when she died, my memories of her, again, very warm person, not the slightest hint of pretension about her at all. Very warm person. You know, even though she was to the manner born, she was very gracious and warm. There was no sense of snobbery in her at all.
And so she married Mr. Kosinski, and your mother knew Jerzy Kosinski.
Yes, absolutely. And everyone ran in these circles. These bunch of friends and their acquaintances all ran sort of together and went in vacation together and did many, many things together. So my parents became a part of this. My father, of course, being married to my mother, she brought her into this. So many times they would spend weekends in New York and go to New York. And my mother was there very often on photo shoots as well.
So Mary Weir played no part whatsoever in the Manson murders, but she was an entree, and she introduced your mother to some of those people who were. Is that correct?
This is true, and particularly Abigail Folger, who, to my memory, was, even though I was just a child, she was such a kind, warm, caring, gentle person that when, you know, a young child, a small child gravitates to an adult, because we don't have, as children, we don't have any preconceived ideas of anyone. You just meet a person and you accept them for who they are, or how they really treat you, how you're received by them. But again, such a warm individual, and so soft-spoken, very gracious, very beautiful modulated voice. You know, she had beautiful taste, not only in, you know, everyday life and quality and clothes, but in things as well, and in art. She majored in art. But my memories of Gibby, everyone called her Gibby. Her name was Abigail, obviously, but she was such a loving, hands-on kind of a person. This kind of a person, you know, taking me on her lap and telling me stories, even singing to me, buying me ice cream, all of these things. And it was, I think her philosophy on life was, what could she do good today to make a difference in the world? What could she do for someone to make their life better? Because I think that gave her some sort of gratification and validation. Because I think because of her Catholic upbringing and because of her sense of obligation, she wanted to make a difference in everyone that came in contact with her, a total stranger or someone that she knew very well. And she particularly loved children. I think she would have been a great mother. And again, my mother was quite good friends with her and a very warm and dear person.
So Gibby was one of the victims on that August night in 1969 in Los Angeles. She had a friend who was also a victim that night.
Yes.
Who was that?
A man named Wojtek Frykowski. Wojtek Frykowski was a friend of Roman Polanski's from Poland. And again, very well-educated man, very brilliant man. Again, all of these people were highly intelligent, and being European, you know, they had beautiful educations in that. And he came from a brilliant background himself. And he met Abigail through Jerzy Kosinski and at a party. And Gibby worked at a bookstore in New York.
This is in New York?
This is in New York. This is way before California.
Okay.
This is in New York at the Gotham bookstore. And it was a huge art house. and they sold beautiful books and art supplies and ink and pens and nibs and all of these things and beautiful stationery. And because her degree was in art history.
Right. She'd gone to Radcliffe. She had a
went-
great education.
yes.
She had a great family background.
She really did. And so she loved all aspects of art from all over the world, and she had a great eye for art. Well, through Jerzy Kosinski, she met Wojtek Frykowski, and
Right.
they hit it off. And because none of these people really spoke English very well, the Poles from
yeah.
Europe, but they all were very fluent in French. And since his English was very halting, you know,
Yeah.
Gibby spoke beautiful French,
Uh-huh.
and she had spoken it all of her life, mostly. And even
Right.
her mother, Inez, kept up her French until the day of her death. So everyone spoke French, beautiful French. So anyway, they conversed mostly in French. And through Wojtek, she met the artist Witold Kaczkankowski, Witold K, who he's known as Witold K, a very brilliant 20th century artist, and in my opinion, I think the finest 20th century artist that is living among us, and his own unique style. He is an absolutely brilliant man. What a talent, what a tremendous gift.
This is a painting by Witold K.
This painting here is by Witold K, and they, again, everyone became friends because you're talking about, it was the 1960s and people were very open and very, especially in these circles, you know, you're
Right.
talking about, you know, very highly educated people, and so everyone really gravitated toward everyone else. You have so much in common. So instantly, you know, he and Gibby hit it off.
Right. So this would have been in like 1968, something like that.
68.
They
you
were
know,
in New York.
late 67, 68, early
Okay.
68, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so, you know, Gibby became very good friends with Witold and even gave him a key to her apartment in
Right.
New York, and so that he could come and go, you know, and paint and whatever. But this painting not only was painted in her apartment in New York, it belonged to her, he gave it to her, it was given to her. And that's what makes this painting, to me anyway, because of my memory of Gibby, that much more wonderful, and because this painting belonged to her.
So on the back is written, at Gibby Folger's,
Yes, New York, 1968.
New York, 1968. We're going to come back to this
Yes.
because this painting was quote unquote lost between that time and this last year, but Chris found it. That's a really interesting part of the story. So, okay, here we are in New York in 1968. We're at Gibby Folger's house. Witold K is coming in. He's got a key. This is where he painted this
Yes.
painting. Okay. Then suddenly they're in Los Angeles.
Yes. They went to Los Angeles in the fall of 1968.
Okay.
Because he felt that he wanted to break somehow into films. His very dear friend Roman Polanski had made this huge success in Europe. Yes, everyone had went to Los Angeles in the fall of 1968.
Right.
And Gibby and Wojtek Frykowski, because of his deep friendship and lifelong friendship with Roman Polanski, had decided he wanted to get involved in the film industry in some fashion or other.
Right.
And so they drove to Los Angeles, and they went there and got there in, I think, September of 1968. And so that's where they stayed up until through the tragedy of 1969.
So we're talking about we're talking here about Gibby and Wojtek,
Yes.
but Witold also ended up in Los Angeles.
Yes, he came there as well. And I think he came there a little bit later, but he ended up opening a gallery in Beverly Hills on Wilshire Boulevard, and in the Beverly Hills Hotel, I believe it was.
Right.
And it is amazing. Again, when you meet people like this, you know, you have lifelong friendships. And the friendship is very important, especially in the European sense of the word, whereas Americans maybe sometimes are transitory about their friendships. It's not so in Europe. And again, they would have been friends, I think, for life. Indeed, they were.
And so, okay, we know that Sharon Tate was primarily associated with Hollywood. We know that Polanski was coming to the States and making films in those days. But you met Sharon Tate as well. Did
Yes.
you see her back in New York, or did you see her in Los Angeles?
In Los Angeles.
Oh,
Because,
really?
Yes, my mother, long before Polanski, my mother had known Sharon. when Sharon started modeling. And so this was fantastic because, again, this is a person who was not famous at the time, and a lady that loved children and loved her family and loved life and everything else. And again, my memories are so warm and so beautiful of the ice cream cones and hamburgers and hot dogs that she bought me. And we went even to Mass together. She took me to Mass on numerous occasions, you know, and my mother and she and
Sharon did.
Yeah, oh yeah, she was Catholic, as we all were. But she was this wonderful, warm spirit, loved animals, and you know, her parents raised Yorkies. And she always had a dog, you know, and I love dogs, so she always had a dog.
She was from Texas, I think.
Yes, she was from Texas.
But she was living in Los Angeles by the time we're talking about now, 1968, 1969.
Yes, but then this was even before 66, 67,
okay.
5, 6, and 7.
Right.
She was already in Los Angeles,
right.
even at that time. And she had went to high school in Italy.
Oh,
and she had brought many things back from Italy, she and her parents. She went to Vicenza American High School in Italy, and this is where this comes in.
So how did
Pinocchio.
How did you get that Pinocchio?
She gave this to me.
Sharon Tate gave that to you?
Yes, she brought this back from Italy. It is wonderful. It has suffered over the years. The nose is of rubber, and unfortunately it has really sadly deteriorated. Mm-hmm. I never played much with this because it's not really something you can really cuddle with as a child and snuggle with, but he just sort of sat in a chair in my bedroom and looked.
You're a visual person anyway.
Very visual.
Okay, so you could appreciate this without cuddling it.
I could, even as a child I could. But every time I looked at it, you know, my parents always held this very dear and impressed upon me how important this Pinocchio was, because this lady who didn't have to, she, you know, who needs to give a little small child the time of day anyway? Right. When you're an adult and you're trying to get your career started and you have other things on your mind.
Right.
But she just loved children, and she really loved people.
Right.
And all people. Sharon had no prejudice for any human being, no matter what they were. She live and let live, and she just had this very open heart and a very open soul. And every time I look at it, I think of her, and even growing up, I thought of her every time I looked at it.
It's wonderful you kept it.
I did keep it. It's one of the very few things I have toys from my childhood. This is one of the few things that has not been lost over time.
Right. So we're in 1969. Vitold K has a gallery in the Beverly Hilton, and Gibby and Wojtek are living together.
Yes.
Not on Cielo Drive, in another house.
Yes, on Woodstock Road.
On Woodstock Road.
Yes.
And Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, married couple,
yes,
had rented this house on Cielo Drive. Is all of that right?
This is correct. And the house initially had been built for actress Michelle Morgan. It's actually was based, it's no longer standing, but it was based on a farmhouse in the north of France. Mm-hmm. And a very beautiful house. But it was not pretentious. It was more just homey and very warm. Right. And Sharon had always liked it. And she had been to parties there in the past.
Right.
I have never been to that house.
Right.
So I have never been to that house. I was to their other house as a child, and when Sharon had an apartment in LA there many times, but not to this house per se. Okay.
And so, we're in like the spring, maybe April 1969. Sharon and Polanski have rented this mansion on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. Gibby and Wojtek are there near, living in another house, and Vitold is also in town.
Yes.
How is it that it transpired that Gibby and Wojtek were at the Tate residence on that night in August when the Manson group murdered them?
Well, when Roman Polanski had to go to Europe, to London, in the spring of 1969, and Sharon had contracted to make a film there, which is fine. And so they asked Gibby and Wojtek to occupy the house on Cielo Drive so that it wouldn't be vacant. And plus Sharon had her dog there and all of this. So there were a lot of reasons why. And then they arranged for Witold K to occupy their house that Gibby had rented on Woodstock Road.
I see. So Witold goes into Gibby's home.
Yes.
And Gibby and Wojtek move in with Sharon Tate, and Polanski's back in Europe.
Yes.
So that's why they were there at
Yes.
that time.
Yes, they had started moving out. By August, they had already started moving out back into the house that Gibby was renting on Woodstock Road.
I see.
And so that's why they were there. And Sharon being pregnant and that, so, you know, she didn't want to be alone. And again,
Right.
they stayed until, you know, Roman Polanski would have returned from Europe.
Mm-hmm. There was another person who was there on that night, Jay Sebring. Who was that?
Yes, Jay Sebring was a very famous men's hairstylist, and he had a unique style of cutting hair, which he developed himself. And then he branched off and started developing hair products and hair care for men, which was really the first of its kind in the world. Mm-hmm. He was innovative this way. Mm-hmm. But again, a very warm person. I met him on a few occasions, very warm. And this is, again, because this is pre-Polanski, pre-Roman Polanski. Very warm, kind, nice
Jay, you're talking
person.
about.
Yes, yes. Again, just like everyone, there was not a person that I encountered or a friend of my mother's that was not beautiful. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean interiorly warm and just very nice and genuine. Mm-hmm. No artifice at all. Mm-hmm. But he had been engaged to Sharon earlier.
Jay Sebring was, yes, that's right.
Yes, and so this is why they remained friends.
I see. So we're not going to go into details of the murder and the aftermath and the investigations and all of that, because that's not what this story is about, and it doesn't really relate to Chris or the things that he's brought with us here today. But there are a couple of things. Before we move on to the story of the painting, which is you will really find very hard to believe, tell us about this little paperback book.
This little paperback book Gibby gave to my brother when my brother was in high school, and she said, read this, it is great, you can do many reports and discussions on this book, and then your baby brother will need it then when he goes.
That's you?
To school. That's me.
Okay.
So I now have this book, but it's so great. It's just a little Avon paperback book, but it's precious to me because of who it belonged to. And she signed it, Abigail Folger, Los Angeles, fall 1968. And then she annotated it as well in her hand with little notes in the margins and that. And I love notes and margins and writings in books because it shows me what the person that was reading it really thinks about it.
Yeah.
And again, she was very highly educated and had beautiful taste. And this book is quite literary, and it's a marvelous writing. And so to have that from her, I think means so much. It means a great deal to me.
So you have had these two mementos.
These two, yes.
From Sharon and from Gibby.
Yes.
All of your life.
All of my life, pretty much.
But this one, you just recently got.
I did, July of this year.
How did that happen?
Well, I work for an estate sale company periodically pricing antiques and art. And I went to a house which was formerly owned by a lady here in Denver, a socialite here in Denver, Barbara Fay. Barbara Fay flew her own plane. She designed the interiors for the Israeli Airlines, and she also designed the interiors for the planes of the Saudi royal family. And she lived in a very, rather looking at it, a very modest house at 4200 East Bellevue, which has now been sold to the city of Greenwood Village, and it's going to be maintained. It's going to be scraped, but it's going to be maintained as this wooded area. And the house sits very far back from the road, very beautiful house, but it's very unassuming and not ostentatious in any way.
So she died, there's an estate sale. So she owned this painting?
Yes, we have to go in and price everything in these estate sales before the sale. So I was there this evening pricing things, and one of my co-workers handed this picture to me to look at, and I picked it up and I immediately recognized who it was by. And I thought, oh, because I knew who the artist was from association, you know, I knew who he was. And so I turned it over, and the back of the picture, which you'll see now in the photographs, it says what it says. at Gibby Folger, New York, 1968. And I almost dropped it because I thought to myself, what are the chances that this painting comes into my path,
Right.
especially all these years later,
Right.
here, very far away from New York and California.
Right. We're in Denver, Colorado.
Decades later.
This painting, which was executed in New York in 1968,
Yes.
nobody knows what's happened to it all these
No.
years. You never even knew that it had been painted.
No.
But you find it here in Denver at this estate sale for
I
Barbara
do.
Fay.
And I said, when I turned it over to everyone that was there looking and wanting my input on the picture,
Right.
I said, I know not only who this artist is, because I knew his name,
Right.
but I know and knew personally this lady who owned it.
Yes.
And I was so excited and so ecstatic, and I thought, you know, this has to be with me. So we priced it, and it was quite expensive. But I thought that doesn't matter, because I would have paid, if I had to, many times more of that just to have this. So the sale comes, and before the sale, we sometimes have the opportunity we can buy things
Right.
before the public. That's one of the advantages. Occasionally, you are permitted to buy things. And I went and I wanted to buy this, but little did I know that one of my coworkers also had wanted it. And they bought it. And I was crushed,
Yeah.
very devastated. But I didn't say anything because, you know, you have to be, I wanted to that's okay. You know, it's just a thing. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
And I said nothing, but they then, a day later, changed their mind and said, you know, I got to thinking I knew how much this painting meant to you, and they let me buy it from them.
Right.
And I said, you know, that means more to me than I can say, and I will never forget that, because what a great thing this individual did by not keeping it and by being so gracious and so kind to let me buy it. I will never forget that.
It's a wonderful story. There's something else written on the back of this painting on the stretcher besides what we've been talking about. What is that?
There is an inscription on the stretcher bar in Polish to Roman Polanski. And apparently this all comes into play because after I got this picture, I kept it for months, and I did not go to Witold's gallery here in Denver. I did not do anything. I put it on my wall, and I thought nothing more of it except I just loved it. And a little voice inside me said, well, you know, why don't you go down to his gallery? And, you know, there was this wonderful exhibition in Amsterdam, a retrospective of his work at Sotheby's in Amsterdam. And I thought, you know, get the book, go down and talk to him and tell him your memories and the story of how you got this picture.
Before you go on, Witold K. left Los Angeles, and as chance would have it, he moved to Denver, where we are and where Chris is.
Yes.
So this is just one of those things. Witold K. has been here in Denver, and he has a studio and his home, and he's been here for 30 years. Okay, so sorry to interrupt.
No, it's perfectly fine. And so I finally decided to do it. And I was a little hesitant because of the personages involved in the past, and I didn't know quite, you know, because it's very sensitive.
Sure.
It's a very sad thing. So, but I don't want to dwell on the sad things. You know, we don't dwell on that. You think about what's beautiful and your memories of them. And my memories of all of this is the memories of a child,
Sure.
which is not tainted by anything. And so I went down there, and he was so shocked to see this picture. He said, how did you get this painting? So I told him, and he said, yes, there was an older lady who came into his gallery, and they collaborated on some project together. And so she fell in love with the picture, and he felt obligated to give her the painting. And this is how this picture ended up with Barbara Fay.
I see. So this picture was in Vitold K's gallery or studio for a long time.
Well, I don't know. It could have been traveling around and he could have then got it back. We're not really sure. It was a little bit cloudy about that.
Okay.
So I'm not sure where it was before, but he found it, or it somehow came back to him. In other words, he somehow, after Gibby's death, it somehow came back to him.
How does Roman Polanski fit into this?
Well, the inscription on the back, Vitold wrote this inscription in '09 because he was going to send this painting to Paris to Roman Polanski. And the inscription, which is in Polish on the back, says, "To Roman Polanski, in memory of our mutual tragedy, our mutual sadness."
Nice.
Vitold K, '09.
But he didn't send it.
He didn't send it. It was to be sent, but in the interim of it being in that gallery and being sent to Paris, Barbara Fay came in and said, "I love that painting." And so it was probably just the span of a few weeks or maybe even a few days, I don't know, because I wasn't there, that it didn't make it to Paris.
And so it ended up in the estate sale of Barbara Fay.
Yes.
And thence to you.
Me. And it's a great treasure. I love this picture so much. Not only is it a beautiful painting, and I love beautiful abstracts, but it's a gorgeous painting, but it has a gorgeous story. And how it came decades after it was painted to Colorado and to me, because I knew Gibby and my mother.
You probably have an explanation for that.
I think it's providential. I think Gibby herself or the Almighty found its way to me because the fact that my coworker bought it, and I deferred to that because he has been a lot longer doing that with the company than I have, so it was not my place to say anything. But because it came to me, because he changed his mind and said, "You know what, Chris, you can have it." That means, as I say, that means more than I can tell you. It makes it just that much more special. And I think something was at work in the heavens to have this painting be mine.
It's a story with a happy ending. And there's more to this than what we talked about here before, I think. One of the things that struck me in the aftermath, and I remember it so well, of the Manson murders, was that, as so often happens in the American media, attention turns to the victims. And in the end, you're almost wondering, you know, who are the bad guys here? Because there were a lot of very negative stories about all of the victims of this massacre, about Sharon Tate, about Gibby Folger, and others, the other two who were murdered. And one of the things that has always struck me since I began talking with you about this whole episode in the summer is that your perspective on these people is so radically different than one would have gotten from the media.
Yes.
And I think that this is really an important part because this is something you have nothing to gain or anything by sugarcoating facts. This is your absolute remembrance as a child of how these individuals related to you. They gave you the Pinocchio, they gave your brother the book, and they were always nice to you.
Always gracious and nice to me and very loving. And that's, you know, children, I have a very great memory, and I'm sure most children do. And the memories of childhood can stay with you, whether they be very beautiful, good memories, or whether they be very bad and horrible memories.
Right.
But they're impressed upon you.
Sure.
And when people are loving to you and kind to you and sweet to you and don't shove you aside, but treat you as a little adult, and that you matter, and that they take time out of their day to spend with you and show you that you matter. That's what is important. And, you know, Sharon was religious, and maybe people don't really realize that, but in spite of her modernity and her maybe sort of 1960s thinking, she was quite much a believer and a very religious lady, and Gibby herself was extremely religious and devout, and went to the Santa Catalina school, and very Catholic school, very Catholic upbringing, and being myself.
In Los Angeles, she worked for some rescue agency or some...
She did, and for the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic in San Francisco even before that. But yeah, she always wanted to make a difference in people's lives. And again, Sharon, the same way. When somebody is that gentle and that kind and that loving, you know, and loving to animals and everyone that they meet, I don't think anyone that could ever know them, and again, I only know them from a child's perspective, not as an adult interacting, so it's much different.
Sure.
But children are perceptive.
And your mother's impression of these people?
Oh, very wonderful. Just so kind, so good. Again, very loving and good friends. And this is what's important. And not to ever think about that tragedy at all, but to remember them as they should be remembered, as noble and wonderful and beautiful people. Interiorly beautiful. You know.
Thank you so much, Chris.
You're welcome, Gary. My pleasure.
Thus ends tonight's program. We'll be back here at the same time next week. I doubt if we'll be able to match the content here tonight. Hope you all enjoyed it. And please send us a message if you have any questions. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.